Another reason why I left religion, church, Christianity, and fundamentalism is that church teaches toxic leadership codependency. Now, for those who haven't a clue what I just said, we're going to be discussing how church doctrine, church membership, and the way churches run sets members up for codependency and complete reliance on leadership. And when leadership doesn't fulfill the codependency, the members are then blamed for putting their complete trust in these leaders. They're pretty much blamed for doing what the leadership conditioned them to do initially. So if a pastor falls from grace, retires, or is forced to resign, members go through a grieving death process. I've seen it in 7 churches in 4 denominations. Leadership fosters an environment that causes members to have an unhealthy relationship between members and teachers. A lot of these members basically rely so tightly with leadership. They believe their faith, their growth, their afterlife, their social interaction revolves entirely around this person. It's very cult-like. I've only been in one church that did not have this dynamic, and it was I'm not really sure what denomination, but I think it leaned a little bit more liberal Baptist. This was near Anchorage, Alaska. And all the other 6 churches, the other 4 denominations, were so thick in codependency. I mean, if codependency in a church was like peanut butter, everybody was a PB&J, okay? Everybody in that church basically worshiped, followed, danced, and bowed to this person. Their entire lives, their religion, their identity was around this person's interaction with this member. And codependency can be a natural transition. Codependency can be a very unhealthy environment. Codependency is something we talked about in churches. So you might ask, what the heck is codependency? I've never heard such a thing. I learned about it in therapy. Codependency is similar to transference or countertransference. Transference is in a professional medical relationship when somebody, usually a patient, becomes overly emotionally attached to a therapist, a doctor, or a medical professional. Now, if it escalates to the romantic or demonstrative romantic feelings, sometimes you may have to set a boundary and transfer them to another professional. Countertransference is when a medical professional transfers unprofessional or codependent feelings onto a patient. But let's talk about codependency. It's an emotional and behavioral condition that affects an individual's ability to have a healthy, mutually satisfying relationship. It is also known as a relationship addiction because people with codependency often form or maintain relationships that are one-sided, emotionally destructive, or possibly abusive. So what are the signs of codependency? A tendency to do more than your share in a relationship. The fear of losing the relationship, a feeling of abandonment. An overwhelming need to be assured and recognized. a compelling desire to control the other person, a fear of rejection, a tendency to apologize to keep the peace, problems with creating and keeping boundaries, difficulty making decisions, dishonesty, doing things you don't want to do to keep others happy, poor communication in relationships. So let's talk about when it doesn't involve another person. What about codependency within yourself? It can manifest as emotional numbness, low self-esteem, when your worth feels conditional, a social anxiety between you and other people, editing your words, dissociation, watching yourself, often feeling empty, dead, flat, or shamed. Imagined superiority, trouble regulating emotions, trouble connecting to others, fear of intimacy, sometimes known as the imposter syndrome. So, why do people with unhealthy relationships sometimes create a codependent relationship dynamic? It's all about biology. Usually it involves high anxiety, you gotta have their approval, self-defeating thoughts, some very common co-disorders that have a lot of these consistent behaviors is narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. And now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying people who are codependent in church have these disorders. I'm saying it's more likely when you have a lot of codependent relationships with consistent codependency, you have a higher chance of having these emotional disorders. Now, don't get me wrong, relationships require a certain amount of give and take. The problem is when it enters into the unhealthy imbalance, codependency. Codependency can be an unhealthy obsessive dependence on another person. Codependency, usually it's a two-person thing. It's a willingness to sacrifice one's own wants and needs to please somebody because of self-realized conditional affection. Codependent relationships, not always romantic, even though in stalker movies, codependent relationships are pretty defined as romantic. Codependent relationships are usually found among family, between mother and daughter, mother and father, son and father, siblings, friends, best friends. You see, the problem with codependency is you don't want the best for the other person. You're afraid that if they get other friends, you'll be